So our speaker this evening is no stranger to our group, and he is going to be speaking on the science of longevity, how to improve your health span. While Dr. Kaushal is a comprehensive retina specialist, he's also a world-renowned clinician, scientist, and educator. He is my own doctor and friend, so let's give Dr. Kaushal a warm welcome.
So nice to see all of you. I enjoy whenever Mary invites me and I get the opportunity to speak here, but I'm really keen to share with all of you a framework. I've talked about it in bits and pieces over the last year or two, but I want to give a comprehensive framework for all of you to think about your health and wellness, okay? And many times those words are used interchangeably, and sometimes they can be very confusing. So I'm going to start off by asking a question. How many of you want to live longer? Okay. One person here doesn't. That's a separate conversation. How many of you want to live healthier? And we're going to talk about that, right? So, you've all heard about longevity, right? So what does longevity mean? So longevity is the combination of a healthier lifespan and better health span, right? So let's define these terms. So we know what lifespan means, how many years you live, right? And what does health span mean? Health span means maintaining metabolic function, cognitive function, movement, and free of chronic diseases. That could be a definition. Now, there could be other definitions as well, but this is a framework to think about, right? And what is it that we're trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve living longer with the least minimal or no chronic diseases, right? That's the idea. And so what is, I started drawing this. This is well described in the medical literature. Lots of folks use these types of curves, but let me just tell you what this means. Here's lifespan on this axis, right? That's how long you live. The average American lives somewhere between 80 and 90. Women more than men, okay? And on this side is your health span, and it's in arbitrary units. There's no way to really quantify that. We're going to talk about some methods by using various testing, blood tests and so on, and DNA tests, to help us understand that. But let's just call it from 0 to 50% to 100%. So 100% is your complete functionality, right? You're metabolically intact. We're going to talk about what metabolically intact means, or optimized, as it were. You're functionally at your peak, right? That means both in what? In terms of our nutritional status, right? And also our ability to move, right? We'll talk about what that means, right? The actual structure of our muscles and our bones and flexibility and so on and so forth. And I know I've talked about these in bits and pieces, but we're going to try to put it all together in a way that's meaningful and helpful to all of you, right? So, and then third is what? Third is free of various chronic diseases. That's part of healthy living, right? What are the major diseases that kill 80% of Americans? Probably worldwide, but we know in the US. Yes?
Heart disease, cancer.
You got it. Heart disease, I put in that same category stroke. So heart disease, stroke, right? Cancer, what else? Diabetes, and what else? The other biggie, neurodegenerative disease, right? Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, right? People who have Alzheimer's die earlier, and I'm sure you're aware of this, either with family or friends. Typically people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's die by about 10 years earlier, right? and being free of cancer, right? And what's the other one? The other one is less control, accidental deaths, right? For example, getting hit by a car, right? For example, that's an example. Or having a wrong medicine prescribed, right? That's a significant problem in the United States, right? There's a lot of people who die from that. In the elder population, if you'd like to call it accidental, pneumonia, right? So those account, if you take all those together, right, that's about 80% of deaths in America. Let me clarify that, not accidental. So the vascular diseases, right, heart attack, stroke, cancer, and neurodegenerative, that accounts for 80% of deaths in the elderly in the United States. And like I said, most likely worldwide. So now the question becomes, right, so if that's true, what have we learned? And I've talked about this in bits and pieces over the last couple of years, and we're going to try to synthesize some of this. What have we learned from basic biology, right, experimental studies in the lab? And what have we learned elsewhere, right? Who else can we learn? These blue zones, you may have heard of these blue zones around the world. You may have heard of centenarians, I misspoke, centenarians, people who live to 100 and greater, right? And there's other circumstantial evidence as well that has been built up in the scientific literature that helps us better understand what we're trying to achieve in terms of longevity, okay? So, but before I go start describing those, if this is health span, right, and this is lifespan, what we want to do is maximize this area, right? In other words, we really want to try to push this curve out a little bit so that we're enjoying a healthier lifespan, health span for a longer period during our life, right? So let's say way out to here, and then over the last year or two, and then you're gone, right? So you're maintaining your health span as long as possible, and by maintaining your health span, you're reducing the chance, or one has, I should say it that way, one has reduced the chance of having these chronic diseases. And we've mentioned a set of them, I've talked about them before, but the main ones, just to review again, cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular disease, right? Stroke and heart attack, cancer, neurodegenerative conditions, diabetes. Some of you may have heard of non-alcoholic fatty liver, which is a disease of glucose dysregulation. We talked about that as well. And so on. There's autoimmune disorders that also fall into that category, as a separate category going to chronic diseases. I would tell you as an ophthalmologist and biochemist, macular degeneration is a neurodegenerative condition, glaucoma is a neurodegenerative condition, and diabetic retinopathy, the three major disorders of the eye. They're all neurodegenerative conditions, and they also share glucose dysregulation, as do all these other chronic diseases, okay? We're going to come back to that in a moment. They also share, and I've talked about this before, and it's worth reviewing. So what are the major contributing factors to these chronic diseases that affect health span and reduce the chance, or let me say it a different way, how they promote these chronic diseases? Inflammation, glucose dysregulation I've mentioned, right? How our body deals with nutrients and what kind of nutrients we're consuming, right? We don't particularly have a great diet. A lot of people in this field call it SAD, Standard American Diet, right? And that has a profound effect. It's a profoundly inflammatory diet, and also it promotes type 2 diabetes for sure, right? Which is exponentially increasing throughout the world and the United States. Some of you may even be familiar with that medicine Ozempic, right? It's been touted it's a type 2 diabetes medicine that's been touted for helping reduce weight. And if any,
I want it.
No, you don't want it. what the studies show is 2/3 of the weight loss with Ozempic. It's the latest craze in medicine, right? 2/3 of the weight loss is not fat. Only 1/3 is fat. 2/3 is lean body mass. You're tearing down muscle. So you don't want to really take that. It's good for type 2 diabetics, right? There are other ways to deal with weight, which are much more healthy than that. But we'll mention some of that as well. Okay, so I've mentioned these chronic diseases just to summarize for a moment. I've mentioned to you what longevity is. Longevity is the area under health span and lifespan. So we want this area to increase. So we'd like to be here, right? Instead of here. So here's something interesting. By the time we're between the ages of 40 and 50, we've already lost a bit of muscle mass, right? And we're also starting to lose on our health span, for sure, even though we continue to age, right? And so there are things we can do. Obviously, younger people should start, but even as we get older, there are many wonderful things we can do to impact the area under this curve. We want to increase this area, right? So emphasize it and emphasize it again as well. We want to increase it by what? We want to improve our health span, and we want to reduce the time that you have a chronic disease, right? So in other words, the decline here, right? If you're going, instead of it being over, let's say, a 15-year period, you want it compressed over 1 or 2 years, and preferably you're here, and then nobody wins the game of life, right? We all check out the next day or something like that, without any long-term sequelae of chronic diseases. Now, I want to come back to these centenarians. They've been studied, and they've also, centenarians in humans have been studied. They've also been studied in the lab as well. So there's certain animals that can survive longer for reasons that we're starting to identify. There clearly is a genetic component to living long, right? But what's interesting is these centenarians die of the same disorders that somebody who's over here, right, on this curve, right? It's postponed. In other words, they've managed with the combination, and we'll talk about some of these approaches, with the combination of various factors and their genetics, right? Not all of them have the same genetics, by the way. And so they have a certain set of genetics that reduce the chance of getting cardiovascular disease, reduce the chance of developing profound amounts of inflammation in the body. That's coupled with what they're consuming, right? What they're eating, drinking, and so on and so forth. So we've learned that. We've also learned in the lab, and I've mentioned it maybe 2-3 years ago, but it's worth reviewing. I think it was even before COVID. There's genetic studies. This is how this area of longevity really took off. There was a set of scientists who demonstrated that in the lab you can genetically modify any organism because you really want to study the biochemistry and molecular biology of them. And by studying these various organisms and genetically modifying them, they could increase the lifespan and health span of these various organisms. Okay? And so it's interesting, a set of those same genes are what are found in these centenarians. Now, none of us routinely go out and get tested for those genes, right? And it can be done, but on a practical level, really what you want to do is have a set of strategies or approaches to deal with these various pathogenetic events, right? Remember I was talking about inflammation, the way the body deals with glucose disposal, right? The way we deal with nutrients, right? We're actually probably, most Americans are nutrient overloaded. And what we should be doing is two particular approaches which have been shown very effective is, and again, I know I keep repeating myself saying this now, but is time-restricted feeding, right? So in other words, pick a 4 or 5 hours that you're going to consume all your, now what the studies show, you can consume all your calories for the day in that 4 to 5 hour window, okay? Or you can reduce the total caloric intake, right? Now, in experimental animals, to show or demonstrate longevity, they have to have a reduction of somewhere around 30% of total calories consumed. As a human being, that's extremely hard to do, right? To reduce it, that's a profound reduction in the amount of calories we have. Yeah, I agree. It's hot in here, isn't it? Yeah, is there, we can maybe turn down the AC a little bit, or turn up the AC, I should say. Time-restricted feeding, there is wonderful science from many labs, but particularly a group of labs in Southern California, that have shown that it's very effective in experimental animals and in humans. Okay? So 4 to 5 hours, whatever you want, calories you want to consume for the day, try to do it in that 4 to 5 hour window. Yes?
Are you, what you're describing, is that called intermittent fasting?
Intermittent fasting.
That's what you're
Yes.
talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
And so a lot of people, when they hear the word intermittent fasting, they think of nutritional ketosis, right? You may have heard of that term as well. But keep those separate. We're talking about, it is hard, by the way, it's really hard to go into nutritional ketosis. In other words, reduce carbohydrates so significantly that you're burning fats, right? That's very, very hard to do. And it's hard, even if you are able to achieve it. I actually have a device at home. I bought one of these devices that measures ketones in the breath, right? And my wife and I usually have one meal a day, right? And it's really hard to get yourself into a place of nutritional ketosis. I think after 2 weeks I stopped using that thing because I said, geez, this is harder than I thought, and because I'm busy in clinic, I need some time to rethink about how to do that. And then I contacted a couple of friends of mine who are experts in the biochemistry of ketosis. And indeed, it's hard. But time-restricted feeding, yes, you can call it intermittent fasting if you like, because if you're consuming all your calories in 4 or 5 hours, the rest of the time you're not consuming calories, or there's minimal caloric intake, right? I will tell you, this is a sidebar, but an important one. The most powerful way to reset your metabolism is to fast. The fast, if someone is diabetic, a type 2 diabetic that is, the most powerful and effective way, that's a reversible disease, by the way. I think I've mentioned this to folks in this audience before. And I tell it to my patients all day long. Roughly 85 to 90% of patients have type 2 diabetics in the world and in the US. And the remainder are type 1 diabetics who require insulin injections. Some type 2s also require insulin, but most of them, it's either metformin or some other medicine, right? But that's a reversible disease, and the way you can reset your metabolism most effectively is to do a fast, even one day a month. Now, I can't say I do that regularly. I will not eat for 18 hours or something like that, right? But really, if someone is diabetic, that's really a very powerful tool that doesn't cost a penny, right? Willpower, but that's about it. Yes?
But I thought if you were diabetic, you were supposed to eat every couple hours.
Yes, so that's a partial true statement. So we have a tremendous storage of glycogen, which is basically the storage form of glucose in our muscles and in our liver, right? So you can mobilize that and burn it all off. Now, the longest a person has been without any caloric consumption, right, is over 500 days. This is a man that's published. He obviously can't do that experiment anymore, or at least not in the US. He was in a hospital, right, in New York, and they monitored him, right? And he was on a water diet. I think he went in at roughly 500, 550 pounds, and he dropped back to his normal weight for his height at that time. So what that tells you, and he was diabetic, so it tells you, right, that perhaps some of our current thinking about diabetes is not correct. And there's actually more data to support that, right? But the idea really is to burn off the carbohydrate stores that we have and make our bodies insulin sensitive, right? One of the simplest things you can do, and those of you who see me as a patient and happen to be diabetic or even not diabetic, is to go for a walk after dinner. 30 minutes, you're using the big muscles in your legs, right? That's where you're driving that glucose that we consumed at our meal, and it's going there as a storage form, right? And it's simple enough to do, and we can all do it. Exercise is a critical component. Exercise, if the pharmaceutical industry could actually patent it, they would. Exercise and sleep. We're going to talk about those in a moment, right? Those are incredibly powerful, easy things to do. And I tell my patients this, look, it's not a prescription. So it's different, you know, going to CVS and picking up a prescription for whatever medicine it may be, right? Versus giving somebody a prescription of saying, look, go for a 30-minute walk every day and sleep eight hours every day, right? If you can do those two alone, that has a profound, wonderful effect on our metabolism, right? But I'm going to come back to that a little bit more. So I touch on these subjects, as you know, when I give a chat, and then I move forward and I come back and do some backfill, discuss it a little bit more, so that hopefully it will be reinforced in your mind by the time you read. Yes, please.
I'm sorry to ask you a question.
That's all right.
I just wonder, I've heard that plant-based,
Yes,
like numbing,
Yes.
that fish too?
yes. So this whole area, plant-based diet is wonderful. Look, we happen to be vegetarian in part because of our faith, being Hindus, right? But people have actually studied this. They look at patients who have plant-based diets. Some people eat just pure red meat. You may have heard of this. That's another carnivore diet, right? Then you hear about the paleo diet. Then you may hear about some other diet, right? Ketogenic diet, right? Here's the bottom line with any of these diets. Everybody's body is different, right? Yes, have they been published on and shown to be ineffective in a certain set of population? Yes, that's absolutely true. But excuse me, it remains to be determined how effective it is in you, me, right? Because we're all biochemically different, and we know exactly, we're biochemically different in at least 8,000 different genetic points in our DNA. So we're fundamentally different people. Here's another way to think about it. A patient was asking me in clinic today how this new medicine is going to work in their eye. And I said, look, let me tell you what the published clinical trials data is that was used to get the medicine approved by the FDA. I said, okay, so this is why we're excited about it. Now, how it's going to behave in your eye over time and whether it will be similar or different from the clinical trials remains to be determined. And the way I explain it to patients is we're going to learn together how these medicines work, right? Yeah, we understand the mechanism to some degree, right? But how it interacts in that patient's body or your body or my body is very different from the next person to the next person and everyone in here.
What about water? I mean, they always talk about stay hydrated.
Yes, yes, absolutely. The question is, what about water? So water is a nutrient, right? 70% of our body is water, right? And the most common reason for admissions in the elderly to the ER in Florida is, guess what? Dehydration. Dehydration also, I can tell you as an ophthalmologist and retina specialist, is a moderately common reason for strokes in the eye. I've seen that in patients. I've even seen it in young people, tennis players who don't hydrate well during the Florida sun, and they develop a stroke in the eye because of dehydration. So yes, water is very important, okay?
What type of water? Filtered?
That's another wonderful discussion. Yeah, so it's not such a simple answer. I would tell you filtered water is better, okay? Now there are some waters better than others, right, that you might imagine. For example, some of you have seen the Fiji water, right? Well, there's actually published studies to show Fiji water reduces the incidence of Alzheimer's disease, right? Now here's the caveat. Here's the caveat with any of these studies. Now I will tell you, I drink Fiji water because it tastes good. Okay? whenever one of the major problems in nutritional or metabolic medicine, as it were, is the confusion between correlation and causality. Okay? Let me tell you what I mean by this. Okay? If somebody was studying sunspots, right, and correlating that with, they published a study that whenever there's more sunspots, and I'm just making this up to illustrate the point, whenever there's greater than 20 sunspots observed in a month, there is more type 2 diabetes in the population, right? Now, you might say to yourself, but so there have been studies similar to that, not exactly like that. You might say, well, oh, okay, hold it. So how are sunspots causing diabetes? They're not. They're correlated to diabetes. Sunspots have even been correlated with Wall Street, right? The stock market. Are they affecting this? No, they're not affecting the stock market. It's just simply a correlation. That means two events occur in time with greater probability than they would individually. That doesn't mean that sunspots cause diabetes or sunspots cause an increase in the stock market. It just so happens that they're related to each other in time. Now, here's the thing. Most nutritional studies are correlative studies, right? That if you do X, then B is observed. That the correlation is correct, but is it actually causing? That's harder to prove clinically or scientifically. That's why, this is a sidebar, in a scientific paper, if any of you are scientists or clinicians, you may observe this, but if you're not, here's what happens, right? Is when you do and even when I was in academia, this is how we would write our scientific papers and how we would guide, I would guide the people in my lab to do experiments, is you build up a line of evidence, a series of experiments, exactly the same way that an attorney, a prosecuting attorney, builds up the case about whatever happened, let's say bank fraud, right? It is exactly the same. It is very hard in science and medicine to actually prove that something is causally linked to another thing. But if there's enough lines of evidence, enough scientists, clinicians who are working in the same area and doing the same similar or in the same experiments and they get the same results, then we become more confident that they're actually causally related to one another, okay? And the same thing goes with these recommendations that I'm going to talk to you about. They are correlated. Some of them are highly correlated and may even be causal, right? Let me jump into an example. So before I give that example, let me talk to you about, so we've talked a little bit about chronic diseases, we've talked about longevity, right? I'm going to finish, by the way, and tell you about one particular molecule that has amazing results so far, okay? So we talked about longevity as a function of lifespan, how long you live, and how healthy you are. What are the components of health? Okay? So there are certain sets, right? And some of them are almost self-evident, right? One is our cognitive function, our brains, right? What is it that we want? We want to avoid cognitive, any kind of mild cognitive impairment, right? Or Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative conditions, like I mentioned to you, like glaucoma and macular degeneration, right? And so what are those critical components of cognition? It's our executive function, right? In other words, how we make decisions. And some of you, a couple years ago, we did that on a series of patients here in the villages. We had, it's a little separate from, they came to our clinic and we had a test set up. And I'll tell you why we stopped doing it. And it measured executive function. It's a psychometric test where you're responding with a clicker and looking at a screen at the same time. It took about 40, 45 minutes. So executive function, how we make decisions, the speed with which we react to our environment. Hearing, right? Seeing, tasting, smell, right? And the third is what? Memory. So those are what we would call cognitive function. This particular test is actually used throughout the world. And it's a wonderful quantitative test. I'll tell you why we stopped doing it. Our patients were getting really, really upset with the results, right? And that's, yes, I'm a physician and I love taking care of people. But in the flow of a very busy retina practice and ophthalmology practice, right, to sit down with somebody and explain that to them, that's an hour discussion. On a day when I'm seeing, some of you who come to our clinic, we see anywhere from 60 to 70 patients a day, right? And that's very typical. So they were getting upset, and then when I called them, I actually called them because I reviewed the test results myself. And first of all, they were almost in tears. But it was very revealing, the information that this test is able to undertake, or to identify, right? Now there's shorter versions of that test as well that can be done to measure cognitive function. And we're hoping to get that launched in the context of something that I'm going to tell you about a little bit later. But in any case, that's probably the most rigorous test that I know of for cognitive function. So what are the three elements again, right? Executive function, how we make decisions, right? After taking inputs from the environment. Second, speed of cognition. In other words, how quickly we read, hear, smell, or taste. Any of the five senses, really, right? And then third is what? Memory. Yes. Yeah. Okay? So that's one aspect of our health, right? Is brain function, cognition. What's the second one? You might imagine, is how we move, right? How our muscles, tendons, joints, limbs, strength, and so on are, right? Now, what are the components of that, right? Those are our abilities to move as in walking, right? Walking is a way underappreciated excellent exercise, right? And it has minimal effect on joints per se. I used to run, this is a total sidebar again, I used to run many years ago. I was never a good runner, but I liked running because it was a chance to think hard about a problem that was interesting to me. I stopped doing it because I noticed a series of my retina colleagues and mentors who were 15 to 20 years older than me. Knee, hip replacements, and I'm thinking, I don't want any of that. So I just went biking and or walking. In fact, I prefer to walk. Walking, get fresh air. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. Fresh air, especially when there's trees around, which release this natural compound that reduce stress, right? That's incredibly wonderful for all of us. We don't probably get enough fresh air, right? Although I have to say a lot of our, the folks I've been fortunate enough to take care of in the villages, all of you can go to these beautiful parks, golfing, and so on and so forth. Even the town squares are quite nice. Movement, right? Movement is critical. Muscle mass, right? After the age of 40, we lose 2% of our muscle mass per year. So what do you need to do that, to counteract that? Light weightlifting, twice a week, right? You don't have to be a bodybuilder. You want muscle strength, right? And endurance of the muscle, right? I'll tell you something very simple that all of you can do. Two exercises. Well, three. I'll tell you about three. One, I forgot. When I was leaving this morning, I forgot to put them in my bag for clinic. You know those hand squeeze? You've all seen those. Go out tomorrow and buy. I bought another. We have 2 sets at home. I think they're $9 or $10 on Amazon. Okay, and you can some of them you can turn the tension on, right? Buy that and do it every day. Okay? How do you do it? Squeeze them as tight as you can for 1 minute. You can be watching TV, music, going for a walk. Time it for a minute, let go. Give yourself a 20 to 30-second rest. Do it again for another minute. Do it for a total of 3 times. Okay? Once in the morning, once in the evening. What does it do? First of all, it reduces blood pressure. It has a profound effect on the vascular system. Now, I can tell you, I love to experiment on my own body, right? And that's kind of what's fun about these approaches to improving our longevity, right? You can do it on yourself. You can try it, see how your body responds. Obviously within reason, right? I mean, I don't want any of you to go out and think, okay, well, geez, maybe I should lift cars over my head, right? That's not the idea. The idea is to be able to do those things that improve your longevity, that are reasonable, right? Nothing outlandish. Okay, so that's one. So those hand squeeze. Why did I say that? What is a very common thing? I'm sure you've heard of it among your friends and family that happens in the elderly. Lack of stability, falling on a hand, or sometimes not even a hand, on a face, broken hip, right? Broken knee, or shattered knee, right? And guess what? Total mobility is lost and your lifespan decreases. And what is one of the best ways to break a fall? Hand strength. You have to have the hand strength to be able to do that, right? So it's been shown improving hand strength. I was going to show you the grips that I have. They're simple ones. As I said, you can get them on Amazon for $10, and you can turn the dial on it to determine how much resistance there is. So do it where you're comfortable, right? So twice a day, 3 minutes, roughly 30 seconds in between. And if you want, I'll tell you what I do. Because we drive around all North Central Florida, as many of you know, we have 4 clinics in the car. I'll just squeeze them before surgery, before clinic, right? And we even have those I just saw those. Someone, my wife and Will brought those squeezy balls. You should all take 2, right? They're great. I mean, they're great it's much less tension than obviously those hand grips, but it's easy thing to do, very easy thing to do. It improves blood pressure, improves grip strength, reducing the chance of a fall that can lead to a broken bone, right? And guess what? It improves longevity. That's pretty, I mean, if you listen to it, you go, oh my God, this sounds too good to be true. But there's actually published studies to show this, right? Okay, so that's one exercise. The other, what do you see, those of you who have grandchildren or great-grandchildren, kids are really good at doing? Jumping is one.
They're flexible.
Flexible. What kind of flexible? They can hinge. They can squat. Right? Right? Like this. Can all of you do this right now? Right? Do it every day. Say this is the edge of your bed. Right? Now I can tell you, many of these I was really, really good. I'm very good with the hand grips and the hand strength, because that's actually important for a surgeon too. Right? But squatting is an incredibly wonderful exercise. You can use the side of your bed, right? But don't lean on the bed. Use the bed simply as a way to help with your stability, right? And do 10 squats in the morning. Don't do it before bed, because you're going to jack up your cortisol levels and you won't be able to calm down to go to bed, right? Or in the early afternoon. So squatting is a very wonderful hinging exercise, and kids do it naturally. If you watch a kid, right, a 2-3-year-old, right, they squat, no sweat, and they get right back up. We're like tumbling to one side or the other, right, because we've lost our strength and our stability. Why? Because we sit in chairs, right? If you look at Asian countries, right, I can tell you, like, for example, our family's from India. People especially in the villages of India, they don't sit on a chair, they squat, or they sit Indian style on the floor, which is really good for the spine. It's incredibly good for the spine, okay? Okay, so that's the second, squatting. Third, right? What's another exercise? Our shoulders. We don't pay attention to our shoulders. And you can do a very, very simple exercise. You can put your hands out front, right? Just like this, and lift your shoulders up, move forward, move down, and back. Up, and then you can eventually make it into a circle. And you'll find, I can tell you as a surgeon, right, I do this quite regularly because I'm a big person, and an eye is a small area, and my shoulders are coming in. So at the end of surgery, I'll do exercises to actually open up my shoulders, and this is one of them. The other you can do is really very, very simple, and again, you don't need to go to the gym, you can do it in your bedroom, and I do this very, very regularly. Lift your toes up, right? And push against the wall, like you're gonna push this wall over, right? And hold it, 10 seconds, count however you want. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Feet down, heels down, relax, do it again. You can do that 3, 4 times. We lose a tremendous amount of shoulder strength as we get older, right? The muscles in the shoulder are some of the weakest that we have in the body. And again, you don't need to go to the gym. If you can go to the gym if you want to, of course, right? You don't need to be a weightlifter, right? Or a bodybuilder. What you want is strength in the muscles and to reduce the amount of lean body mass or muscle loss, right? So squatting hits the big muscles of the legs, right? I told you about the shoulders, I told you about the hands, right? And so those are some very simple things you can do starting tomorrow or even this evening when you get home. And those are simple things to do, as I mentioned. But there's other things that can be done as well for stability, right? Walking on your toes. How many of you can walk on your toes from here to that door, right? Most of us, we fall back on our heels. I mean, that's in part because we wear shoes that have way too much cushion in them, right? So you want to minimize the total amount of cushion in your feet, right? But walk on your toes in your house, right? Decide for the next 5 minutes that you're gonna walk on your toes. What's that? Barefoot. Barefoot, yes, I'm sorry, yes, absolutely correct, right? That's a great way to improve the stability. Our foot is largely ignored musculature and bone structure. And it's really important as we get older. Yes?
What about using our alternate hand?
Yes.
Brushing our teeth.
Yes.
with the other.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Using the opposite hand. For example, I'm right hand dominant. I actually brush my teeth with my left hand. You know why I started that years ago? So I could be more ambidextrous in surgery. So I can switch hands if I need to, depending on the nature of the surgery. Absolutely. And they've actually shown when you use your opposite hand, you stimulate stem cells in your brain, right? Because you're rewiring parts of your brain. So when you can, if you're right hand dominant or whichever hand you're dominant, use the other hand, right? To eat, right? Brush your teeth, comb your hair, right? Doing the dishes, those who do them, right? Just as a sidebar, I always kid with spouses after the patient has had either cataract or retinal surgery. I said the quickest way your eye's going to heal is if your spouse does more laundry and more dishes, right? It's not a big winner, by the way. I get a lot of scowls, but we all have a good laugh. Okay, yes, absolutely. That's another wonderful thing to do, if you can do it. There's a whole, at some point, what we should do is have just a session, probably an hour or two, just discussing, movements and simple things to do. Now, here's since we're talking about this, there's so many simple things you can do. If you have a step stool at home, I don't see something that's step stool size, but a 6 or 12-inch step stool, right? Walking up on the step stool without holding anything, walking back off of it. That's great for stability, tremendous for our stability, right? There are, some of you may be participating in yoga, right? There are many, and this would, maybe I should do this at some point. I talk about 15, 20 exercises. A lot of them in the yoga, as many of you know, came from India. And I'm so amazed by it because I've actually taken classes in yoga and I do a set of yoga exercises in the morning along with meditation and my prayers, right? And it's amazing how these adepts, I would call them, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, figured this out, right? And basically what it was to maintain stability, functional range of motion of all our joints, right? And what is the third part of this? We're still talking, remember the first part was cognition, we're still talking about our actual physical structure, the muscles, whatever you'd like to call it, the musculoskeletal system, right? The third part that is described in these yogic exercises, and you don't even have to call it yogic if you don't want to, right? But in these set of exercises is what? Is to be pain-free, right? Those aches and pains as we get older, right? It's related to inflammation in the body. We've talked about that to quite some degree in the past. But exercising, even simple exercising, you don't have to be a bodybuilder. 30 minutes, 40 minutes a day, maximum. You don't need much more than that, right? And perhaps twice a week doing some weightlifting, light weightlifting. You can even have some, I have some, these weight bar. It's a long bar, it weighs about, I think, 35, 40 pounds. And I do a set of curls, and I'll do it for my shoulders, and for wrist rolls, and so on. That's it. Nothing complicated. The idea is to maintain muscle mass, right? We are going to lose muscle mass. The more accurate way to say is to reduce the amount of muscle mass we're losing with age, so that we can maintain strength, stamina, and stability, right? Strength, stamina, and stability is what we're seeking, right? And of course, if you want to put flexibility in there as well. Let me tell you one last exercise you can do. Very, very, very simple. Now, go back to looking at a kid, right? When a young child sits on the floor, right? Let's say they can be squatting, they can be sitting Indian style, or they can be sitting on their bum and they're holding their legs together. They get right up, right? How many of us can still do that? Right? So I started maybe 3-4 weeks ago. I said, because I sit on the floor Indian style to do a set of exercises, yogic exercises, and for meditation. And I noticed, well, I get up pretty easily, right? But I started looking at how I get up, right? What am I using? Am I propping myself up with anything besides my arms? Or more importantly, can I do it without my arms? Just basically using balance and your legs, right? And I'll show you some ways, one of these times when I come back again, we'll talk about how to practice that. It's simple enough. Now, it's not easy the first, week or two, but if you can do that, that's pretty phenomenal, right? That shows you have stability, strength, balance, right? And you do it multiple times. Get up and then sit back down without propping your hands on the floor, right? That is a wonderful exercise. And guess what? You don't need a gym membership for it. You can do it in your bedroom, in your living room, while you're perhaps watching a show or something, or listening to music, or talking to somebody, right? So I've discussed that, the musculoskeletal system, and a set of things we can do to improve that, or maintain it, as it were, over time. Now, what is the key? Trying to maintain as much muscle, just to review again. Maintaining muscle mass, right? Maintaining stability, which stability and strength they go together, right? Because stability is related to strength, and strength is related to stability, right? Excuse me. And to be pain-free, right? Now, as I mentioned to you, exercise is a wonderful, potent way to produce an anti-inflammatory response in your body, as is sleep, okay? And we're going to come back to I mentioned it twice already to say that I'm going to come back to them, but I will. So that's important. 80% of Americans don't sleep enough. 6 hours their studies have been shown by brilliant scientists that that's not enough sleep. Now, I have to tell you, in all honesty and transparency, I usually sleep about 5 hours and I'm awake, and I'm like ready to go. And we all have a different set point, but the average person should be sleeping anywhere from 7 to 8 hours a day. And people talk about, in the field of sleep science, or sleep physiology, is sleep hygiene, right? What does sleep hygiene mean? No phone. How far should the phone be away? In another room, minimum 18 to 20 inches, right? These things produce a tremendous amount of electromagnetic radiation, right? So like these kids who sleep with the phone like this, right? No good. We don't know what the long-term effects of that are on the brain. And furthermore, it should be away. Furthermore, especially, I've seen this in young women, they'll put it here, right? I said, please take that away. It's associated with a very malignant form of breast cancer. So you should tell your grandchildren, daughters, nieces, whoever, don't put it here. Don't even put it on your neck, right? Keep it away from your body, right? Best you can. It's a very, when I first saw these studies, it came out, there was a speaker at one of these national meetings I was at. She was from University of Pittsburgh. I don't know if she's still there. She's the one who published a series of papers. It was so disturbing to watch this. 20, 21-year-old women, otherwise healthy, profound breast cancer and died. And there's a whole series of these, right? So that's one part of sleep hygiene. Dark room. It should be like dark, dark. Not like with a nightlight dark, right? No light dark, okay? I'm very particular, as particular as I can be about my room. And I keep it cold. Coolness is really important for us, okay? This is one of my retina buddies in Georgia. I'll talk to him later. So coolness is very important for the body to get restful sleep, okay? Now, I had mentioned this last time, and I mentioned it to Mary as well. If I may just take a little sidebar again. So sleep is such a big problem I've noticed in my own patients, family, friends, so on and so forth. So over the last, I'd say 6 to 8 months, no, 2 to 3 months, but I've been thinking about it for more than a year, let's say 6 to 8 months or so. We've now developed it as a spray. It's a natural, we have it in the back for those who like it. And we've given it to lots of people, some sets of folks have bought it as well. I've tried it myself. You take about 8 sprays under your tongue about 45 minutes before you want to go to sleep. Our staff loves it. All of them use it. And you're welcome if you'd like to try it. We have it available on that. It's really important to get a good night's sleep. And it's important to have deep REM sleep, right? Where you, rapid eye movement sleep, where you have also those clear dreams, as it were. That's very healthy. Why is sleep so important? So that's another fun, long topic, but let me just give you the important points. When we sleep properly, what happens is there's a debris that collects in our brain, and it gets cleared out of the brain, okay? What is that debris? That debris is exactly the same as what's found in Alzheimer's, okay? And it has been shown that people who are constantly sleep deprived, their cognitive function is indistinguishable of those sets of patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. Right? That's how important sleep is. Sleep is also profoundly anti-inflammatory as well, right? Getting a good night's sleep. Many of you may have noticed, if you had aches or pains before you went to bed, when you wake up, many times those aches and pains are gone, right? Now, of course, some may persist for other mechanical reasons in the body or other reasons as well. But if it's just the regular aches and pains of life, sleep and exercise are a wonderful way to minimize them, okay? So we've covered cognition, just to review again. What time is it, by the way? Oh my God, we're like going by. Yeah, I should wrap up, right? I could go for a couple more hours. I'm having too much fun. I hope you're enjoying it as well. So we've talked about cognition, we've talked about musculoskeletal system, right? I've mentioned sleep and exercise at least a couple times. I've talked about the importance, I'll wrap up here because there's lots of other things to talk about. But perhaps when Mary invites me again, we can continue with this. Maybe perhaps we can do it in a series of, there's so much to discuss, we can break it into a little bit more, make it more discreetly segmented, so I can go into a little bit more depth of each of these subjects, right, or these topics. So we've talked about sleep and exercise, some simple exercises to do the importance of sleep and sleep hygiene, right? And of course, to reduce inflammation. I want to just finish with a topic that's so worthy of talking about each and every time, and that is how our bodies remove glucose from the bloodstream, right? Glucose disposal, sugar disposal. That lies at the center, I should say at the center, it is at a critical point in triggering these chronic diseases like inflammation, and like I mentioned before, how we sense and recognize nutrients, excessive nutrients or not enough nutrients in our body, and how the energy factories of the cell produce energy. So we'll talk about those later, but I want to talk about glucose and wrap it up in the next 2-3 minutes. It turns out our bodies are exquisitely tuned to determine and react to how much glucose is in our bloodstream, right? And many of you may know, we consume way too much refined sugar, right? High fructose corn syrup, which is incredibly toxic. It's processed in the liver just like alcohol is, by the way, right? And the amount of refined sugar that the average American consumes has just exponentially risen over the last 40, 50 years. So here's the simple thing that I would say to everyone, and I say it to my patients as well, is get rid of white sugar, white flour, processed food, and white rice as much as possible. Minimize it, right? Now look, I have to tell you, I love pistachio ice cream, right? But I don't eat it every day, right? I may have it every 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, something like that, right? Or if I have one, we all like things that taste good, right? So there's certain things you like, but it doesn't mean you need to eat, a whole cake, right? You have a little sliver of it, right? Because what you don't want to do is have blood sugar rise, right? And then what happens is insulin rises to drive that blood sugar out of the bloodstream, right? That's part of what insulin does. Insulin has some other remarkable effects. But when insulin rises, it also causes collateral damage by causing inflammation in the body. And even if you're not diabetic, that makes the metabolism or the physiology of the body more prone to these chronic diseases, okay? So we want to keep ourselves insulin sensitive, right? By not consuming a tremendous amount of glucose. And the ways you can do that, of course, is to reduce the amount of refined sugar. Now, notice I didn't say carbohydrates. We all need carbohydrates. There's lots of healthy carbohydrates. Fruits, vegetables, right? Not going overboard with any of those, right? Even meat, for those who eat meat and fish, there's also, besides protein, there's carbohydrates there as well, healthy fats, right? So the idea is not to flood the system, our bodies, with excess glucose. So reduce the amount of refined sugar that we're consuming. Now, another name for glucose is dextrose. The food industry is very clever how they label things, right? So spend some time reading labels, right? What is in this that I'm buying? And what I tell patients in general is anything that is in a can or it has a label on it or it's processed food, try to avoid it completely, right? Fresh fruits and vegetables, as much as you possibly can. Lots of fresh air, good sleep, simple exercises. These are ways to help improve your longevity. I've run out of time. I didn't run out of time, but I'm expecting Mary's time and all of yours time. I wanted to talk to you about rapamycin, but we'll talk about, that'll be a tantalizing, hopefully, leader for the next conversation.
Touch on it,
Just touch on it. Okay. All right. Rapamycin is a natural compound that's produced by this bacteria in Rapui, this island, right? Easter Island. And many years ago, 1965, there was a chemist, an Indian chemist actually, he was working for one of the large pharmaceutical companies. That island was opened up to the world. And he harvested this dirt, discovered this bacteria, and discovered this compound called rapamycin, okay? Now, rapamycin in the United States is approved, actually throughout the world, for immune rejection in kidney transplant patients at 5 milligrams per day, okay? However, in all of the experimental studies that have been done in the lab, from yeast, fruit flies, bacteria, human cells, mice, dogs, rats, and so on. It's the one compound that's improved longevity and health span. Okay? Now, many years ago, our lab discovered its use in patients with retinal disease. And that's a separate fun story to tell. And we published a series of papers on this. But I've used rapamycin for years off-label, right? So just as a quick aside, 80% of drugs that are used in America are used off-label. That means they were originally discovered for one purpose, right? And so they got their FDA approval. But it turns out clinicians and scientists discovered that there was other uses because we started to understand the mechanism better of how these drugs work. Let me give you an example. For example, when patients have a very severe eye infection, we inject certain antibiotics into the eye. That is totally off-label, but it's the gold standard of practice, right? Bone marrow transplant, which is used for cancer patients, that's an off-label use, right? But it's the gold standard, right? And I'm just citing one. These are just a few. There's thousands of examples. But anyway, we started using it off-label for our patients with certain types of macular degeneration and inherited disorders with wonderful results. But I also, at the same time, had been, as a biochemist, the other hat that I wear, was very interested in this longevity phenomenon that was observed. So it turns out rapamycin has been shown at low dose, significantly low dose, often anywhere from 3 to 6 milligrams once a week, to improve nearly all biomarkers and functional components of health span that we know of, right? Again, that's an off-label use, but that's a short answer. I'd love to talk about it in detail because it's really captured the attention of clinicians and scientists all over the world.
Well, can you write us all a prescription?
So the answer is, it is possible to do it. Obviously, as a clinician, I could. But what I would do is I would want to get a whole series of tests, right? Metabolic tests. And there are ways to do that. The effects of rapamycin are so remarkable, it almost sounds like snake oil. But the biochemistry is so well rooted, we know it's not snake oil, that these are real effects. Now, I will tell you, are there clinical studies to show the effect of rapamycin, placebo-controlled clinical trials? No, there aren't any. But in longevity, you'll never get those clinical trials. Because think about it, how long do you have to wait? 80, 90, 100 years, that's just impossible, right? So there's a lot of wonderful anecdotal evidence that's accumulating in the human literature about the use of rapamycin from various things from cardiovascular disease to stroke to improvements in inflammation, and it goes on down to diabetes and so on and so forth. Right. Yes? It is actually, I wouldn't call it an antibiotic. It is a compound that specifically affects a particular protein in the cell called the target of rapamycin that was discovered many, many years ago. And that particular protein, it downregulates that protein. It has a profound effect on the metabolism and the balance of the cell. Okay? So I'll leave you, yes?
Why would a doctor order it for your script for it? I'd have to ask you for it specifically. How could he justify writing you a script for it? How could the doctor,
Well, I'll tell you how it's being, I have quite a few colleagues around the country who are prescribing rapamycin for pain. It has to be, it's really coming from the patient who may be informed about this, wants to learn more about it, and or is willing and wants to get started on rapamycin because of their own health conditions, right? But to me, the proper responsible way to do that is to get appropriate metabolic testing first to really understand what is happening in that patient's body. Because as I was mentioning, one of the remarkable things about rapamycin is it makes the body very insulin sensitive. So you can actually test that before you even consider giving a patient the medicine. Okay? Good. But we can talk about that more. I just gave a little bit there. Good.
You're awesome, thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, it's been a big honor. Are there any quick questions that you would like to ask him before he?
Yes, please.
Yes, you spoke about fatty liver and diabetes.
Yes.
Could you go into that?
Yes, so non-alcoholic fatty liver is related directly to insulin resistance. Yes. Okay. Did your doctor check your insulin and fasting blood sugar levels? Most internal medicine and primary care doctors don't do that. They should be. That should be a routine test on everybody. So another simple recommendation is, if you have it, get a fasting blood sugar and blood insulin level, right? And ask your primary care doctor, internal medicine doctor, cardiologist, whoever it may be. And you can go on a website, you can calculate your insulin resistance yourself, right? It's a HOMA score, right? And it's very simple to do. You just input your insulin level and your fasting insulin level and fasting blood sugar. Yeah, so all the more reason you should have that done. A1C is a useful test. Everyone has heard of hemoglobin A1C for diabetics, but it turns out it's less useful than we thought it was, because what's more important is to maintain blood sugar between 80 and 160. The time in range, it's called TIR, right? So I'd recommend that.
Fatty liver, alcoholic, non-alcoholic fatty liver.
Yes.
Is this as serious as, drinking alcohol?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Okay. But it's reversible, unlike alcoholic liver disease. Yes, make your body insulin sensitive as maximum, right?
I really enjoyed what you talked about today. Some of it, for instance, non-exercise, the last 2 days, I just felt like, osteoarthritis.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
So, and I was looking at these arm exercises, and I do have 5 pounds.
Yeah, that's good enough weight.
And I was looking at and just what you did today, and also one of the exercises show, write your name, just hold.
Yeah.
Just hold it, and just write your name.
Very good. Yes, please.
We're talking about sleep.
Yeah.
You know, what happens if you get too much sleep? You lay in bed too long.
You become lethargic.
I mean, as soon as you get older, you need an nap in the afternoon.
There's nothing wrong with a nap in the afternoon. There's absolutely nothing wrong, except it shouldn't disrupt the time you go to bed at night. All right? You don't want to take a nap at 4 and then go to bed at midnight and then get up at 6, and then you're shifting your circadian rhythm, right? So if you normally go to bed at, let's say, 9 to 10, and you're taking a nap in the afternoon and going to bed at midnight, not so good. So either take a nap earlier, right? Or figure out how not to take a nap. Maybe do some exercise to stimulate your body a little bit. But there's nothing wrong with a nap. Yes?
Metformin is being touted as a
Yes.
different drug for different uses now than other for diabetes.
Yes, yes.
Is that
I
a
didn't
good
talk
thing, a
about-
bad thing, or is that just?
So metformin is another drug that is very actively being researched in longevity science, right? There's actually a national trial called the TAME trial, looking at, it's actually run by quite a famous clinician scientist out of Albert Einstein School of Medicine, New York City. I don't know, I think I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. It's Neo Berzelius. You can look him up on the web.
Okay.
So metformin obviously regulates blood sugar, but it has some other interesting properties. But the effect of metformin in experimental studies to date is, I mean, rapamycin is absolutely remarkable. It's like hitting a grand slam at the bottom of the ninth to win the World Series. Metformin is hitting a triple in the bottom of the ninth. It's still very good. There are studies to show, at least in non-humans in the lab, that those two can be potentially synergistic. But rapamycin still seems to be, has the most profound effect. Yes.
With kidney disease, rapamycin good, bad?
So if somebody has kidney disease,
Yes.
yeah, that's a longer conversation. First have to document to what degree the kidneys have been affected, right? and what is the cause of the kidney disease as well. Okay? Is there a question here? Yes.
This helps in by the 5-hour feeding span. What's the benefit to our bodies when we restrict that to that 5-hour time frame?
Yes.
And is it like cleaning out stuff? And is it due to like how our ancestors ate way back when they ate during the light hours?
Yes.
And of course it got dark at
Yeah.
a certain time, and then they naturally slept.
Yes.
What is it? How is it helping our bodies when we restrict to the 5 hours?
So what you're doing, I didn't talk about that, that's a great question, is what happens if you time restrict your feeding? See, basically what you're driving your body outside of that, let's say 4 or 5 hours, whatever it may be, right? Is basically you're reducing profoundly the amount of nutrient stimulation to your body. By reducing the amount of nutrient stimulation, that is similar to the effect of rapid rise. Right? Not exactly, right? But it's mimicking it to some degree. And so why is that important? Is what you're doing is that particular protein called mTOR, you're inhibiting it. And thereby, you're helping the body clear debris from the cells, something called autophagy that I've talked about in the past, right? And also, you're burning off your native carbohydrate stores, which are in your liver and in your big muscles, right? And you're starting to use fat. Fat, I have plenty of my own, right? Right? Is a much more effective fuel compared to glucose in terms of energy production.
So it teaches your body to be more efficient?
Yes, yes. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaushal. Let's give him another big round of applause.